The next thing I want to talk about is that within our joints we have both a roll and we have a glide. All right. So one of the things that happens is as you bring your arm overhead, we have the ball spinning within the socket. We also have some gliding that accompanies this. All right. And the shoulder is kind of unique because there are set rules on how a roll and a glide work. However, the ligaments that surround the shoulder joint are going to affect the position of the ball in the socket. But if you understand the roll and the glide, when we do certain movements like a dip and you have a whole lot of extension of the shoulder, the forces are moving forward within the shoulder joint. And that's the glide portion. And if we don't have good stability within the musculature that surrounds the joint, or we have a lot of laxity within the capsule, then we can end up with trouble because now we have the ball moving around in the socket. And that's the whole idea behind subacromial impingement syndrome. We're not getting good control of the ball within the socket. The ball is moving, potentially irritating structures around it. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about mechanisms of injury. Now, I think that mechanisms of injury are super duper important. I don't feel like that we stress this enough when we're trying to learn about the shoulder and ways to keep our athletes safe and ways to rehabilitate. So how the heck are people actually getting hurt in the gym? All right. Sometimes when we talk about rehabilitation, we talk about what's beneficial to get people out of pain. However, how do they get into pain in the first place? Right? We all know that prevention is going to be more powerful than rehabilitation. We don't want to just keep hurting ourselves and rehabilitate, hurting ourselves and rehabilitate. Let's figure out why people are getting hurt. And then from there, we can keep them safer in the gym. And then once they rehab, we can make sure they don't go back to the physical therapy office. Okay? So here are some of our theories. Now these are based in traditional shoulder literature as theories as to why people are getting hurt. And it's also our slant. All right. If you go into the literature and you start looking at subacromial impingement syndrome, you're going to find a lot of literature, but you're not going to find literature in the same population that we work with. You're not going to find literature in a CrossFit athlete. You're not going to find literature in a powerlifter, Olympic weightlifter, or gymnast. There's some, but there's not a ton. So it's one of these things where we're extrapolating and we're trying to figure these things out as we go. And it's a lot of theory that's based in science, but a lot of it, again, is theoretical, and we're trying to figure things out as we go. All right. So through the literature, what you'll see a lot of times is a lack of dynamic control within the shoulder joint, a lack of timing, and also issues with weakness and endurance. And this has to do with the rotator cuff as it relates to the deltoid. Now, what's important to understand is that when you press something overhead or when you bring your arms overhead, and this goes for pressing horizontally too, just like a bench press, the deltoid is very active in order to allow this motion to occur. All right? However, the rotator cuff, and this is a supraspinatus tendon, is very active in pulling the ball into the socket. So you see these arrows here. The rotator cuff fires, it's supposed to bring the ball into the socket. The deltoid fires, all right, to bring the arm overhead. But the thing about the deltoid is that it's going to give a superior or upward force of the ball into the socket. All right. So here's the thing. As soon as I press, the rotator cuff is supposed to fire before the deltoid. And what happens is that the ball is supposed to be pulled into the socket before the deltoid is active to start bringing the arm overhead. Now, if I don't have really good control of the rotator cuff, then one of the things that happens is the ball migrates superiorly. And we just talked about the subacromial space where the rotator cuff lives, where the long head of the biceps live, where the bursa lives. If we're not getting really good dynamic control from the rotator cuff, and the deltoid is just going willy-nilly here, we can end up irritating or compressing some of these tendons. All right? Now, what's really important to understand is that when we bring our arms overhead, this space always gets smaller. The subacromial space always gets smaller every single time I bring my arm overhead. So here's the thing. If I'm bringing my arm overhead too much, with too much volume, too much frequency, I can irritate these contents regardless of how good my technique is. All right? And that's the major reason why we believe over time people get things like rotator cuff tears or rotator cuff impingement, just because the tendon is taking tensile loading, or it's loading through the tendon itself, and it's also taking compressive stress. And too much over time may be associated with these injuries. All right? Okay. So we just talked about this, the deltoid and supraspinatus. So here's your supraspinatus, here's the deltoid. So we just talked about how timing is really important. So if the timing of the rotator cuff, it doesn't fire first, then deltoid is going to fire first, so the ball is going to move upwards in the socket. The other thing is if the rotator cuff is not strong enough, then what's going to happen is the deltoid is going to overpower. All right, and the last piece, if the rotator cuff doesn't have good enough endurance, then deltoid is going to take over. If we're doing a high rep set of overhead press, a high rep set of some sort of push-up, some sort of pressing exercise, and the rotator cuff fails because of poor endurance, then all of a sudden you're getting extra motion of the ball within the socket. This extra motion moving upwards of the ball in the socket is going to increase compression and stress of the tendons. And again, this is the major mechanism of injury. So it makes sense that the rotator cuff needs to be incredibly strong, right? It needs to make sure it's firing properly, make sure it has really good endurance so it can handle everything that we're throwing at it over time, and we're decreasing the amount of stress through that tendon.